You are listening to ESG News and Views from the Conference Board.
Hello, this is Paul Washington, Executive Director of the Environmental, Social, and Governance Center here at the Conference Board, the world's leading nonprofit think tank serving business and society for over 100 years. The ESG Center focuses on helping companies define and fulfill their evolving role in society by providing timely and relevant insights for what's ahead in the areas of corporate governance, sustainability, and corporate citizenship. In today's podcast, we're going to address a topic that's on the top of many minds, if not every mind, in corporate America, which is the upcoming rules on SEC disclosure on human capital management and other ESG topics. And as companies are getting ready for those rules, it's really good to look at what companies have already been doing in the area of human capital management disclosure since the new SEC rules were put in place in November 9th of last year. Today, we're going to talk about what companies actually put out in the first wave of disclosures relating to human capital management. And for that, we're going to talk to Solange Charas, who is a senior level human resources expert with over 30 years of experience as a consultant, practice leader, corporate executive, and board director across all industry sectors. I'm also proud to say that she's a distinguished principal research fellow at the Conference Board's Human Capital Center. Welcome, Solange.
Thank you, Paul, for having me on. I feel so old.
Well, I'm not saying how many years of experience I have in this field, so we'll just skip right over that. And in addition to Solange, we're joined by Ross Jeffries, who is Deputy General Counsel and Corporate Secretary at Bank of America. And the perspective he's going to bring is as an executive at a company that has done an extraordinarily good job at providing both investors and other stakeholders with Bank of America's story on human capital management. And, that process just doesn't start figuring out what goes into your SEC filings. It starts well before that. So I'm really thrilled to have you join us too, Ross, for this discussion. Welcome.
Thank you, Paul. I'm very honored to be here. Look forward to our conversation.
Terrific. So Solange, you recently looked at all of the 10K and other SEC filings companies made. There were 344 of them made between November 9th, 2020, when the new SEC Human Capital Management Disclosure Rules went into effect, and March 31st of this year, to see what kinds of disclosures they were actually making on human capital management. We all know that the rules provided companies with a wide latitude to provide disclosures. They only had to provide disclosures on items that were material, and the SEC was not at all prescriptive of what topics they needed to cover. It was really up to each company. So can you tell us, based on the filings that you saw in those first 4.5 or 5 months or so, what topics did companies cover in their disclosures? Which were sort of the most common, and which ones did companies really not disclose?
So the 8 areas that we identified as being germane and critical to human capital governance quality included board diversity and effectiveness, workforce diversity, equity and inclusion, talent acquisition and deployment, workforce capability and development, worker health and safety, worker compensation and benefits, executive compensation, and lastly, culture, engagement, and workforce experiences. So when we looked at the filings, we tried to find information that fit those 8 categories. So one of the most interesting things that we discovered is that not all companies disclose on all topics, which we didn't expect. But what we found was for each topic, we found that only about half of the companies disclosed any information at all. So we had about an equal amount of companies being silent on one of these 8 categories, as well, an equal chance of them being silent as actually disclosing information.
That's really interesting. And did you find that there were some areas where companies were more likely to disclose rather than others? I think there were some actually sort of surprising findings in that.
Yeah, we found that the most prevalent disclosure was about COVID, which we would expect given this last year, the last 18 months. The second most prevalent disclosure was around comp and benefits, which is also not very surprising. But the surprising disclosure was around talent acquisition and deployment. We found that kind of interesting that companies are actually they're more likely to talk about how they're acquiring and deploying talent than any of the other 5 categories that weren't already disclosed on.
Great. And what were the 2 lowest categories of disclosure? Where did companies reveal the least?
The least amount of information we had was in the area of workforce capability and development. So companies aren't really talking about how they're developing their employees. And surprisingly, board diversity and effectiveness. So those were the 2 most surprising findings where companies are silent.
Great. So thanks so much. That's really helpful background. So yeah, it is interesting that even with the new SEC disclosure rules, and these are all companies that had to file a Form 10K during that period, basically, that half of them basically didn't include anything meaningful on human capital management in their filings in those first 4 months. That's quite notable. It's also interesting to know what topics they did and didn't cover. So, Ross, you fall into a different category from those companies that didn't include human capital management in their disclosures. You all include a fair amount. But before you get to the disclosure stage, you have to have robust disclosures. You have to have a robust human capital strategy. Talk about how you've got the workforce you've got and what you're going to do to get the workforce you need in the future. Can you tell us a little bit about how Bank of America developed its workforce or human capital strategy? And what was the board's role in that?
Well, going back at least since our CEO became CEO in 2010, Brian Moynihan, since he's led the company, we've operated under a strategy of what we call responsible growth. And there are a number of pillars for responsible growth, including, being customer centric and managing risks well and winning in the marketplace. But the 4th pillar of responsible growth is that the growth has to be sustainable. And one of the ways that we aim to have sustainable, responsible growth is to be a great place to work. And so there is a infrastructure and culture built around that, just as we have systems in place to compete in the different areas where we're competing in the marketplace, whether it's consumer banking or commercial banking, corporate, et cetera. So the responsible growth has been the way Brian has directed the company, that the strategy that he would like. And the board has been completely supportive of that. And frankly, the results that the company has had under Brian's leadership are, validation of the strategy. And so, as you said, Paul, the disclosure story is, you've got to have a good story to tell for the, for the disclosures to be meaningful. And so we felt like we do have a really good story, and we disclose in different places. As Solange noted, the 10K is one. We've got a proxy statement. But in 2019, we put out what we call a human capital management report. And we followed that up in 2020 with the second edition of that. And there are we really use it as a vehicle to tell our story, the whole narrative of being a great place to work. So it took a lot of information that we might have had on our website or other disclosures that we had, and we put them together in this report to really shine a light on this strategy of being a great place to work.
That's really helpful. And I think you really do set a standard by bringing this all together in one place, because otherwise companies' disclosures are often sort of scattered between their 10K, the financial filing, the proxy statement, which goes out in connection with the annual shareholders meeting, various places on their website, maybe a CSR report as well that's somewhat separate. So bringing it together in one place seems to make a lot of sense. So how did you decide what you were going to put into your disclosure on human capital management? Because there are so many topics you can cover. How did you sort through them and say, these are the ones we want to feature, or did you decide to feature them all?
Well, no, we were targeted about it. The evolution is interesting. We have a year-round shareholder engagement program, and I think maybe in 2018, maybe in early 2019, we were meeting with Brian and Sherry Bronstein, our Chief Human Resources Officer, and Ann Finucane, our Vice Chairman. And we were kind of giving Brian feedback on what we're hearing in our engagements. And it kind of all came together at once, where we kind of said investors love hearing our story in the engagements, and we point to the several places where we might tell this. And we all kind of had a light bulb moment where we said, we ought to pull this together and make it easier for them. But to your point, we didn't want to just create this huge set of materials that may not be useful to people or useful to our investors. And so, Brian said, let's ask them what would be helpful to them. So as we went through 2019, we did, another round of engagements, and we talked to our largest investors, and we told them what we were thinking about doing. And we got great feedback. First of all, yes, please do that. Second, on the actual content, we got very good feedback. So that was kind of how it was built in the first edition. Second edition, we added in a few more items that investors told us that they wanted. And then we also added in a pretty robust section on, our response to the pandemic. So that's kind of how it was built. And we're looking into, version number 3. And we still, in our investor engagements, we still get good ideas of things to include.
I think what you're talking about is really interesting because it underscores how investors view human capital management, or less technically, your worker welfare, as a key measure that they look at in terms of corporate performance. Last year we did a report on what investors expected companies to do on social issues. And the overriding response from investors representing $12 trillion in assets under management. And those investors told us that when it came to racial, health, and economic equality, they really wanted companies to focus on human capital management. So it is telling that you're hearing from your investors, you're consulting with them on what you put into your human capital management report. So Solange, when you were looking at the disclosures that companies made in the first 5 months here under the new SEC rules, you looked at whether they included, as you said, just qualitative information or quantitative and qualitative information. And look, in some places it's fine to disclose just qualitative information, and that may be more meaningful. But could you tell us what areas did companies make disclosures on quantitative information and not just qualitative information?
Yeah, absolutely. First thing to note is that there was twice as much disclosure that was qualitative in nature than quantitative. So about 67% of all disclosures are qual, and only about 33% of the disclosures are quantitative in nature. And the most prevalent disclosures that included quantitative information, again, probably no surprise, worker compensation and benefits, workforce diversity, equity, and inclusion, which also makes sense. And it was a little bit of a tie between workforce capabilities and development, which is interesting. So they're actually giving numbers around the number of people that they train, develop, and what happens to them in terms of mobility and advancement with data underneath it. The other area where there was some quantitative information was around board diversity and effectiveness. So most companies didn't disclose board diversity and effectiveness, but when they did, they put quantitative information around it.
So Ross, tell me about the areas where you decided to make quantitative disclosures and not just qualitative ones. Did you basically include quantitative measures in as every part of your story, or were there some areas where it just wasn't appropriate to include quantitative information?
with respect to the 10K, our disclosure there is much more streamlined, let's say, than what we have in the Human Capital Management Report. I think on that, I don't think Bank of America is unique among issuers in that, we not only just included what the bare minimum of what the rules are, but we are kind of seeing how does the market settle in the amount of disclosures. We have this information out there in the Human Capital Management Report or the proxy statement, and it may end up in the 10K at some point, but for the first year, out of the chute with the new rules, we were, much more streamlined. But with respect to the quantitative metrics that we have out there, it's a wide range, and top down, whether it's the board diversity composition, senior management composition, and then we go 3 levels deep in management of diverse composition with women, people of color, and that broken down by Black, African American, and Hispanic and Latino. And then we also give information on pay equity by male to female in the U.S. and person of color to non-person of color in the U.S. We've done that for a number of years in the proxy statement. We include, as I said, the employee engagement scores and our turnover results. So it's a wide range. As part of our story on DEI, we also include information about our incoming class of recruits coming out of college, our summer interns, and those that are coming to Bank of America out of college. We give a picture of the diverse representation there as well. So to show we have a pipeline in place from beginning of careers through middle of careers and then senior management, as I said, the top 3 layers.
Yeah. Well, that certainly goes beyond what's required and is really quite impressive. You mentioned earlier that your investors seem to react quite well to what you were doing. Could you talk a little bit more about that? How they reacted and how maybe employees and others have reacted to your more robust disclosure on human capital in the last few years?
Yeah, absolutely. I think from our institutional investors have been supportive, across the board about the quantity and the quality of the information. As I said, we get feedback from them saying, well, have you thought about adding this or that? And so we do. We're thinking about it. And it makes the conversations with them go a lot smoother. We're able to send them the Human Capital Management Report, ahead of our meetings, and it just makes the quality of the interaction a lot more robust and deeper. We're able to get, into much more interesting topics, and it really helps them understand. Companies talk about culture. I think from the investor's standpoint, it's really hard to understand what that is and what it's like. And, this report does bring it to life much more than just kind of hearing good things. Mm-hmm. We're not shy about indicating, this is where areas where we need to improve. And there are several, and we're very transparent about that. We understand. So again, it just brings the conversation to life. So investors are very supportive. And you mentioned employees, and it has been a terrific tool in our recruitment efforts. We send this, it's obviously available on our website, but as we, recruiting people, we send it to them, and so that they get an idea of what it's going to be like when they come to work at Bank of America. So it's just overall, it's been a positive experience, and we've really haven't heard any negative feedback. Our directors have been very supportive of it, and from the beginning when we told them that we were thinking about doing this. And I would also add, it's also used in the communities where we do business, where we might be calling on, we bank, of course, all over the country, and we might be calling on a large corporation, and they, they see this is the kind of company that we're to do business with. So it's really been overall a strong marketing tool for us in any number of areas.
That's really interesting. And because the way it sort of works under the government rules is your human capital management story can be really fractured. And it's interesting that you brought it all together in one place, and that's serving actually multiple stakeholders, employees, communities, business partners, no doubt. Importantly, investors and the board too, because it's also, I'm sure, a great way to make sure your board is fully informed. And I also am struck by you said that you include both the good stuff and the stuff that still needs improvement. And we've got a report out recently on how to tell your sustainability story effectively, authentically, and reliably. And part of our recommendations to companies is make sure that you tell a balanced story. Don't just only put in the good news, because you want to be honest, you want to be authentic, and you have a lot more credibility if you acknowledge those areas where you can do better. So Solange, on how the market responds to human capital management disclosures, I know it's kind of hard to draw too much in the way of conclusions, but can you talk a little bit about total shareholder return and the disclosure patterns we've seen?
Yeah, absolutely. So in our Brave New World report, we actually identify some financial indicators on how to understand whether or not your human capital is actually generating economic returns or economic value creation for the organization. And one of the things that we look at are these types of financial indicators and also total shareholder return. What we did in our research is we looked at a couple of indicators. We looked at ISS and we also looked at TSR. We actually specifically picked organizations that provided quantitative disclosure around DE&I, since that seems to be the biggest issue that everyone's talking about. And what we found was that the 68 or so companies that provided quantitative information about DE&I are actually performing the same right now against their TSR for the industry. So we're not actually seeing right now any big movements in terms of disclosure and TSR. And it makes sense because you can't disclose in one quarter and have the impact felt in exactly the same quarter. But we did learn a lot about the Bank of America experience. And what we learned about the Bank of America experience, because they have been disclosing this information for 3 years or so, 2019, 2020, and now into 2021. What we're actually seeing is that Bank of America, we believe, because of its transparency and these disclosures, may be experiencing higher TSR because of it. So if we look at the industry numbers, the 3-year TSR for Bank of America is about 35% compared to the industry, which for the same period, which is about 14%. So is there a relationship between Bank of America's transparency and its total shareholder return? I can't answer that question with any, specificity with statistical significance, but I would like to believe that the increased transparency about human capital issues and how that's translating into employee engagement is driving higher levels of economic value creation for the organization and their stakeholders.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for the very clear and thorough and balanced answer on that. I appreciate it. So Ross, at a lot of companies, they're grappling with how much information to provide on their workforce, whether it's in 10K or in their proxy statement or elsewhere. And, in some companies, it's still the view that, hey, if it's not required, we're not going to disclose it. So you all go quite far beyond that. So what are the main lessons you've learned in providing really robust human capital disclosures?
Well, I understand, having practiced securities law for 30 years, I get it that it might be, a little nerve-wracking. But as we said kind of at the beginning of of the session that, for us, there was already a great story. It exists. And so it was a matter of, let's tell it. And so that would be the lesson, is that if companies that have a great story to tell, if you're a competitive business competing for, talent, use that as an advantage in the marketplace. And that's one of the reasons we're doing it.
Really helpful answer. If you've got a good story, make sure you're telling it. No reason to particularly hide it. And if you don't have a great story, maybe think about whether you want to have a better one. And so, Solange, last question for you and for Ross as well. Apart from complying with the new SEC rules that are going to come out on disclosures on climate change and human capital and other areas, what do you see as the main challenges or opportunities on the horizon for companies when it comes to human capital disclosures?
I think that the biggest challenge for companies is going to be the rules-based disclosure guidelines that are going to be coming out at the end of the year. And then their second biggest challenge is going to be in how to create a compelling narrative around the results generated from those rules-based approaches. I'm a big proponent of transparency, and I firmly believe that just like the ISO standard around human capital governance, that companies that are more transparent actually perform better. I do believe that. I also believe the companies that do good do well. And I think that ESG and all parts of ESG disclosure is an opportunity for companies to demonstrate how good they're doing.
Got it. Thank you, Solange. And Ross, so apart from the SEC rules that are coming down the pike, likely take effect later next year, and really apart from telling your story, because you already do a great job on that, what do you see as the big challenge when it comes to human capital in the upcoming period?
Well, I think one of the challenges, it's not just in the horizon, but it exists today, is this kind of alphabet soup that we have of ESG disclosures, and we're really hoping to drive convergence, and this is broader subject than just HCM, but that's a part of the ESG disclosure framework, and so we're really hoping to drive that convergence among different standards. And so one of the issues might be what your European investors are used to seeing, or what they might by regulation see versus elsewhere in US or et cetera. So that's one of the challenges. I think I hear from a lot of people, my peers, that all the different standard setters on ESG disclosures and competing requests for information. So that exists today, and so we hope that over time there does become a uniform standard. I think possibly on the horizon post-pandemic. By that I mean not necessarily after the pandemic's over, but just as a result of the pandemic. I think there'll be a lot of different metrics that we may see on flexible work arrangements, what employers are offering there, and what that is one area where you could see possibly, different employers taking a different strategy with respect to that. And then, that is as a disclosure and a recruitment tool, one way or the other. So that's one thought.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I think you're right that, a traditional area for some industries to disclose was employee or worker health and safety. And companies, are being asked sometimes to disclose some of their particular benefit policies, from everything from in vitro fertilization to others. And now, I think that's a great point, that we're likely going to see increased demand for disclosure in other areas about workplace practices and workforce practices rising in the wake of as a result of the pandemic experience. Just one comment. We will be coming out with a report at the conference board on the effort to harmonize all the alphabet soup of various reporting frameworks from GRI and SASB and so forth. I'll give you a bit of a heads up, which is don't hold your breath. We unfortunately, we commend your work in trying to seek harmonization there, but it's going to be hard to get harmonization among those reporting frameworks because, as you know, many of the reporting frameworks are still very much featuring how they bring distinctive value to the table. But along with what you said, we noticed, and we were working on our Telling Your Sustainability Storytelling report, which I recommend for people's reading pleasure. We did notice a much greater receptivity of the corporate community to a disclosure regime that includes some standardized, required disclosures across industry, and then some flexibility to talk about things that are particularly material for your company. So that's actually a shift in the corporate community from the past. And I think it's consistent with what you're saying, Ross, that, let's agree on the things that pretty much all companies should disclose, and that may lighten the burden for companies in the long run and for investors and others trying to do comparative analysis.
Agree.
Well, look, so this has been a really enlightening conversation. Thank you so much, Ross and Solange, and thank you all for listening. You can find a number of the reports that we've mentioned here: The Brave New World of Human Capital Management and Disclosure, Telling Your Sustainability Story Effectively, What Investors Expect Companies to Do on Social Issues, on the podcast's webpage, along with some other resources. And finally, you can always find additional podcasts, webcasts on all things corporate governance, sustainability, and corporate citizenship related by visiting the ESG News and Views site at conference-board.org. So thank you all again for listening, and thank you, Ross and Solange, for lending your experience and your really wonderful expertise to this podcast. Thank you.
This has been ESG News and Views from the Conference Board.